today. I'm going to a book that I have neglected for a number of years, and it's a little book in the Old Testament, the book of Ruth. I have always loved the story in the book of Ruth, and I'll tell you some reasons for that in a moment. When Benjamin Franklin was an emissary to England before the Revolutionary War, he was there for about 5 years, and he was associated with some literary society. And the members of that society were very critical of the Bible. They were a part of this secular revolution that we talked about in the Bible study class this morning, and said there was nothing of literary value at all in the Bible. And at one of their meetings, Ben Franklin stood up and just read, without telling the source, the book of Ruth. And it received just generous and wondrous acclaim after he read it, and they wanted to know who the author of that wonderful short story was. And Franklin said, well, it is the book of Ruth from the Bible. German philosopher Goethe has said of the book of Ruth that it is the loveliest complete work on a small scale. He said of all the smaller works that have ever been written, the book of Ruth is the loveliest. It begins really with tragedy, with the loss of a husband, of a woman. Her 2 sons marry, and she loses her 2 sons. And yet, for all of that, in its beginning, there's a story of satisfying relationships among human beings. And specifically, there are satisfying family relationships where there is regard, respect for one another in the family. There is a closeness and there is a concern in the family that causes everyone to act on behalf of everyone else, people not thinking especially of themselves. There are people who act out of responsibility to others. They make decisions for noble reasons. They make decisions based upon fixed principles, not how I feel at the moment or what may be for my momentary advantage. And they made decisions like that because they had a reverence for God, which is evident throughout all of the book. What is the book of Ruth about? Is it about Ruth? Well, Naomi figures greatly, and Boaz is such an admirable character. And it does seem that it begins with Naomi, who is the mother-in-law of Ruth, and her tragedy, and ends with her great comfort in her old age. But you certainly have to see Ruth as a central character. You have to see Boaz as a central character. And the emphasis is upon Ruth in the 2nd chapter as she goes out to do what she can to obtain food for her and her mother-in-law. And that shifts then to Naomi when she sees where this can lead, and she gives advice that is certainly good advice. And yet the initiative belongs to Boaz in the 3rd chapter as he acts with honor to claim Ruth and to provide not only for Ruth but to provide for Naomi. So actually the book is not about Naomi or Ruth or Boaz. The book's really about God and his blessedness and his blessing and caring for the people who love and serve him. It's seen in such places as the 2nd chapter in verse 12, where Boaz addresses Ruth, who is gleaning, and I'll talk about gleaning in just a moment, in one of his fields. And he says to her, Jehovah recompense thy work, and a full reward be given thee of Jehovah, the God of Israel, under whose wings thou art come to take refuge. Then she said, let me find favor in thy sight, my Lord, for that thou hast comforted me. God used Boaz to comfort her, but the book is indeed about God. Maybe that is one of the things that makes it such great literature, makes it such a great story and a moving thing. And as God cares for Ruth and for Naomi, You come to the end of the book and find a child being born to Ruth named Obed. Obed is the father of Jesse. Jesse is the father of David, the king. So we're reading about David's great-grandmother. And then you come to Matthew, the 1st chapter and verse 5, and here is this Moabite maiden, not of Israel, a Moabite by birth who comes into the midst of Israel to serve God. And you find her in the lineage of Jesus Christ himself. Now, you can't hardly find a happier ending than all of that, with all of this honor that comes to Ruth. And a good story ought to have a happy ending, and this has one. But I want to talk to you about 3 terms, and one is gleaning. There was a law in the Old Testament about this. If you've got your Bibles, turn back with me to the book of Leviticus, to the 19th chapter. Leviticus 19, and let's read verses 9 and 10. Here was one of God's welfare laws, and there's something about it, I think, that is admirable and that we might emulate today. Leviticus 19, verse 9 began, "And when ye reap the harvest of your land, thou shalt not wholly reap the corners of the field, neither shalt thou gather the gleaning of thy harvest." So when you go out to reap your fields, leave the corners. And after your workers have been through that, don't go back and pick up the leavings that are there. And why? Verse 10, "And thou shalt not glean the vineyard, neither shalt thou gather the fallen fruit of thy vineyard. Thou shalt leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. I am Jehovah your God." God wanted the needy provided for, but he did not have them a welfare check written so they could sit at home without any responsibility and without any respect and receive that. They went out, they worked, they gathered. They were able to work then out of self-respect, knowing they had done something to help support themselves, even if it were at the mercy of others. There is something worthy in doing something to effect an end. I'll say more about that toward the end of the lesson. But gleaning is involved in this story of Ruth. So is levirate marriage. If a man died having no children, his brother or nearest of kin was to take her, the nearest one available, the nearest one without wife, and sometimes even with wife. And the first child born to that marriage would inherit in the name of the deceased. The rest of the children would inherit in the name of the new husband. And this was established in the law of Moses and practiced. And it was another way that widows were taken care of. It was another way to keep the land intact, to keep possessions in place. And there is then the law of land redemption. If you owned land and you were in terrible need so that you had to sell it, it was only bought for a particular time. You could buy it back later. Or in the year Jubilee, every 50th year, all the land returned to the owners thereof. And if you were going to redeem the land of someone who died and there was a widow, then the widow went with the land. So watch for all of those elements in this story. And note that as the book begins, it is in the time of the judges. And yet, this is such a happy story. It is a happy story of good people, of righteous people who are acting out of concern for others. And really, this is not typical of the time of the judges. I'm going to discuss a few facts about the times of the judges, but I want you to think about that point. The time of the judges is not a very happy time. There was no central government. There was no king. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. There was no unifying principle. There should have been God and the law, but they had turned to idolatry. They were constantly disobedient. God had to raise up saviors for them who eventually, upon their repentance, God would use, that is, upon the people's repentance, God would use the saviors to deliver the people and to keep the land intact. But you have a wicked time. You have a time of people not paying a great deal of attention to God. But in the book of Ruth, the people did. Now what that says, and what I want these future facts to emphasize, is that no matter how bad the times are, no matter how bad and wicked people are, and the age is, there can be good, righteous people doing and accomplishing good. And that's what you have. You look at the time of the judges and remember a man named Gideon. Can you remember anything about his father? His father was an idolater. He had a Baal. He had a Sheerim in the worship of Ashtaroth. And the people of the city went out there. He was a leader in this worship. This is in the time of the judges, a time of idolatry. And then, of course, there are Samson and Delilah. Samson, one of the judges. And this is a story of simply unprincipled desire. Samson behaved like a spoiled brat, thinking that any woman he wanted ought to belong to him and he could have her. And it is a story full of immorality. This is the time of the judges. And then there is the time when a group of Benjamites gang rape, leading to the death of a Levite concubine. One of the most horrible stories, I think, in all of the Bible. One of the things that is the most disturbing is that story. And I hadn't intended to tell it, but having said that, let me tell it. And this doesn't say something only about the Benjamites. This says something about this religious person, this Levite. He has a concubine. A concubine is not someone who is illicit. It was kind of a second-class wife who didn't have the status of a first wife. And the Levite was traveling with his concubine, and he was given a place to dwell. And the men of the city assaulted the house similarly as they did in Sodom. And the man of the house said, "Here, don't bother this man. Let me give you my virgin daughter and his concubine." And the men would not hear to that. Why would people think like that? Because this Benjamite and the man who took him in were going more by the convention of that day than they were the law of God, which taught righteousness and mercy and love. It was simply in that day, in that ancient time, that when you gave someone hospitality in your home, you were responsible for them. And with the lack of a civil government, a central government especially, you were to be a man of strength and to show that they were safe there. And if for some reason they were not safe under your roof, then it was a terrible insult to you. So what a person had to do above all else when he extended hospitality was make sure that his guests were safe. Now somehow that did not get down to the concubine. It pertained principally to the men. And so when the men outside continued to make the fuss, the Levite took his concubine, he shoved her outside, they took her and they raped her all night long. And when it was morning, she climbed and crawled back to the doorstep where her master was and fell down there. And he opened the door and finds her lying there and says, "Get up, it is time to go." And none answered. She was dead. And he was angry, and he had her cut up into 12 pieces and sent one to each tribe of Israel, telling what should happen to all of those tribes if they did not respond and help take vengeance and wreak vengeance upon the tribe of Benjamin, which they did, and just about for all practical purposes wiped Benjamin out, because Benjamin defended the men who had done this crime. There isn't one happy note in all of this. There's not an admirable character there. Not only the men who did the assaulting, but the Levite himself and the man who took him in are all totally reprehensible. I'll be careful about the word totally, but were reprehensible characters. This was the time of the judges. Samson and Delilah, and the selfishness and the immorality that is there. Gideon's father, the idolatry that is there. And in this, we have the story of Ruth. I'm going to read the first 18 verses of the book, but I want to draw this contrast. You'll find it a book of happiness, serenity, of goodness. In fact, when you look at the way people behave, if I can borrow the words of a commercial, it really doesn't get any better than this. And you look at Samson, man, it's party time. in the time of Samson with the feast that took place, and there was prostitution, there was self-interest. It was today, it was 3/4 of the television programs you watch on television, and I hope you don't watch that 3/4 or 9/10 or whatever it is. But it is today, in the time of Samson, man living like that, and it just doesn't get much worse than that. What's the lesson there? Where people have a Godward attitude, where God is the focus of their lives rather than themselves. There's righteousness, there's goodness, there's happiness, there is serenity. Happiness is not going to be found in self-indulgence. Well, to the book of Ruth, chapter 1, verse 1, beginning. And it came to pass in the days when the judges judged that there was a famine in the land. And a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. And the name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the name of his 2 sons Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. And they came into the country of Moab and continued there. And Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left, and her 2 sons. And they took them wives of the women of Moab. The name of the one was Orpah, the name of the other was Ruth. And they dwelt there about 10 years. And Mahlon and Chilion died, both of them. And the woman was left of her 2 children and of her husband. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the country of Moab, for she heard that in the country of Moab how Jehovah had visited his people in giving them bread. And she went forth out of the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return into the land of Judah. And Naomi said unto her 2 daughters-in-law, Go, return each of you to her mother's house. Jehovah deal kindly with you, as ye have dealt with the dead and with me. Jehovah grant you that ye may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voice and wept. And they said unto her, Nay, but we will return with thee unto thy people. And Naomi said, Turn again, my daughters, why will ye go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb, that they may be your husbands? Turn again, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say, I have hope. If I should even have a husband tonight, and should also bear sons, would ye therefore tarry till they were grown? Would ye therefore stay from having husbands? Nay, my daughters, for it grieveth me much for your sakes, for the hand of Jehovah is gone forth against me. And they lifted up their voice and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clave unto her. And she said, Behold, thy sister-in-law is gone back unto her people and unto her God. Return thou after thy sister-in-law. And Ruth said, Entreat me not to leave thee, and to return from following after thee. For whither thou goest, I will go, and whither thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. Where thou diest will I die, and there will I be buried. Jehovah do so to me, and more also, if aught but death part thee and me. And when she saw that she was steadfastly minded to go with her, she left off speaking unto her. And they finally come to Bethlehem. And I thought about reading this entire story. And I think it would be effective just to read it. And I'll have to admit, I just didn't have the courage to do it. That's part of the reason. And the other reason is I don't have time to do that and say some of the other things I want to say. So what I would encourage you to do for your own benefit and just enjoyment in reading a good story with good information is in the next few days, perhaps even this afternoon, to sit down and read the book of Ruth. If we think Naomi is a good person, I think we are right. And yet even a good person can hit points of depression and feel low and maybe say some things that are unwise. And she begins to blame God for her plight. She is a widow. She has no one but her daughter-in-law. She returns to her land. How shall she live? What shall she eat? She feels certainly forsaken in all of this. But it is the time of the barley harvest, and Ruth decides she must go out and glean. She will go out to where they are harvesting the crops, and she will go to the corners, or she will go to a field that has been picked, and she will find the leftovers there, and she will bring food back for herself and for her mother-in-law. It was her hap, and we'll come back to that in a moment. The text says, to light upon a portion of the field that belonged to Boaz. She tarried a little bit in the house, and she went out into the field. Boaz came and greeted his workers, and he saw Ruth and said, whose damsel is this? And they told him, and that she was related to Naomi. And that meant something to him because he is a near kinsman. He is a relative of Elimelech. So Boaz gives certain orders, and he commands the young men not to bother her, and that is to harass her. Sexual harassment is not anything new. That's what he was forbidding the young men to do. And he made sure she was cared for. And after they had lunch of parched grain, he made sure an extra portion was given to her, more than she could eat, and she saved that up. At the end of the day, she will take that home to Naomi. And he went to her and said, go with my maidens and go into the field. You do not have to wait until it is gleaned, and pull and eat. And he told the young men, pull some out and put it in her way where she can gather it up. And he told Ruth also, drink of the water my maidens drink. So he made it as easy on her as possible, as convenient on her, because he has been impressed with her. It does not say because of what she looks like. I think you read the story and have to get the impression that he was attracted to her. But what particularly impressed him was her kindness to this other person. He is first of all attracted to her for noble reasons and for character. That will last when physical beauty is gone. That will last when the nice clothes are gone. And I don't think Ruth probably had many nice clothes at this particular time. What was in the person, in the heart, what was in the character is the most important thing. And that is what he saw. And that is why he was treating her as he was. And she thanked him, fell down at his feet in gratitude. She does take the grain home to Naomi, and Naomi is aware that something unusual has happened here. She has all of this grain, which is unusual to have that much from gleaning. Here's the parched grain she has left over for lunch, and she questions Ruth. And Ruth said, well, I was in the field of Boaz. And the light goes on for Naomi. She says, he is a near kinsman. Now, from what I've told you about near kinsmen, you know two things. That if she in her distress seeks to sell this field, she will have to sell it in the name of Ruth, because it would have been inherited by the son of Elimelech, and Ruth is his widow. And someone has the right and really the responsibility to take Ruth and to marry her and bring up seed to the name of Ruth's husband. All of this goes on in the mind of Naomi. And so she said, after some time had passed, they will be at the threshing floor this evening. Go to the threshing floor, and after Boaz has eaten, and after he is settled for the evening, you lie down at his feet, uncover his feet. Now I suppose there would be people of immoral background and immoral nature who would read a lot into this, and who would think certainly unrighteousness is going to occur, immorality is going to occur, fornication is going to be there. I mean, you just got to take advantage of that, and that's the way a lot of people would think today. But they're thinking from their background. They're thinking from the way they are. And there's not a thing untoward in all of this story. And so Ruth does that. The harvest now has been gathered in. They are over at the threshing floor to get out the good grain. That is a process that is going to take some time. The men will be there. They will be doing the work. And Ruth goes into where they are sleeping, uncovers his feet. And about midnight, he is aware that someone is there and is startled. And Ruth identifies herself and said, "Spread thy skirt over me," which simply means take responsibility for me. Exercise the right of the near kinsman, take me to be your wife. Ruth, in effect, at the behest of Naomi and according to the law, proposes to Boaz. And he blessed her. He was not displeased with all of this. He said, "You are more righteous than I thought. You did not go after the young men, whether rich or poor. You have come to me in harmony with the law of God." And he said, "But there is another who has the right before me, and that must be satisfied. But let me see to this matter." So Ruth went home the next morning, and there is some propriety that is exercised here. He did not send her home in the midst of the night for fear for her. He had her stay there under his protection, but early in the morning, while it was still dark, before one could discern another, he gathered more grain, sent that home with her, and she left. He did not want it heard that there was a woman at the threshing floor. And of course, the only reason people would consider that a woman would be there would be for immoral purposes, because all of the men are gathered there to work. He did not want to sully her name. He did not want to sully his name. And so she was sent away, and Naomi said, "He knows he will not rest till the matter is settled." So he went to the gate of the city, and he watched, and surely enough, the relative who had the first right passed by. And he had gathered Boaz, the elders of the city, to witness this. And he said to the man, "Elimelech's widow, Naomi, is going to sell a field, and you have the right to it as near kinsman." And he said, "I will buy it." That would simply add to his property. But then Boaz said, "When you do, you must buy it at the hand of Ruth, who goes with it." And then the man thinks, not only is there then the price of the land, but the son that is begotten of Ruth, if there is indeed a son begotten of her, will inherit not in my name, nor be first my son, but will inherit in the name of Ruth's husband. So I will pay for the land. It will cost me to support Ruth, and I will lose the land eventually. So he said, "No, that will mar my inheritance. You may take the right." And Boaz had said, "If you don't do it, I will." And so Boaz took the right. He purchased the land, and Ruth became his wife. And they had the child Obed, who became the father of Jesse, who became the father of David the king. Now I want to go back and emphasize 3 points. I want to talk about the family relationships that I mentioned earlier. I want to talk about the formula for happy people. And I want to talk about the blessedness of God consciousness. There was Ruth and Orpah, the daughters-in-law of Naomi. Isn't it remarkable, the scene that we saw transpiring between them? As Naomi gets up in Moab and she is heading home, and she tells her daughters-in-law, "Go back to your mothers. You're still young. Find husbands. Be married and be happy." She is concerned for them, and she mentions the blessedness of the daughters and how well they had treated not only their husbands, but how they had treated her. Here is family. Here are family relationships intact. And they were intact because of the regard that people had, the regard they had for God. Now Orpah is content finally to go back to her family and to her idolatrous God. But Ruth said, "Thy God shall be my God." And the point I would like to observe is that Ruth also had a love for God, which kept her in this family relationship and its responsibilities toward her mother-in-law. I don't think you can say anything very bad about the decision of Orpah, except she goes back into paganism. She did cry and weep with her mother-in-law. It is only at the strong appeals of her mother-in-law that she does leave and go back. And in some ways, that's not necessarily a bad decision, except for the religious aspect of it, and that'll have consequences. But Ruth not only loved Naomi, Ruth also had come to respect and have a regard for God, and that made the difference, and that's why she would stay with this destitute widow. That's why she would go out into the fields and glean. Orpah loved her mother-in-law, Ruth loved her mother-in-law, but Ruth also loved God. And this love for God enhances family life, it enhances family relationships because it teaches people responsibility. It emphasizes to the parents their responsibility for the children, and something that is almost totally neglected today, and I'll put the word totally in there, is the responsibility of children for the family. The children today are being reared like Samson, like spoiled brats. No responsibility, nothing they have to do, nothing they have to accomplish. Simply sit and receive and get and receive. But when one has a regard for God, and one is taught to honor father and mother, and one learns what respect should be, that enhances family relationships, and it teaches children their responsibility for one another, for the parents. It teaches them responsibility for the family. And that is something that is not easy to accomplish in our age. You know, we live in a wicked age. We live in an age of party time. We live in an age of prostitution. We live in an age of immorality. So did Ruth and Naomi. But you had people who learned what responsibility was. And they took those responsibilities upon themselves. And likewise, you know, family relationships can enhance our understanding about God, because God reveals himself to us as a father. He is the Father. We are his children. Without going into that point in length, we can go to the 103rd Psalm in verse 13 and read there, "As a father pitieth his children, so God pitieth those that are his." There is the comparison of that relationship. And if I can appreciate, because I'm aware of God, what my responsibilities are to the family, and then I realize where I stand in the family and its relationships, then that helps me to understand circularly the relationship that exists between God and me and my responsibility in his family. There is needed emphasis upon the family today. It is in dissolution. It is in disarray. And we are hurting because of it. But if this nation and its citizens had a more Godward attitude, more responsibilities would be exercised that would lead to more ideal families and the kind of compassion and concern and loyalty that you find in the book of Ruth. But let's talk about this formula for happy people. Remember, the text said of Ruth, it was her hap to light upon the portion of the field that belonged to Boaz. Well, as you read the story, it is not just happenstance. God's providence is at work here. But one might say it was her fortune, even though God was behind it, to come to this particular field. And we have a word that comes from that. Well, first of all, you have things hap in. And I said that the way New Jersey folks say that. They hap in. Down south, it's happen. I'm not going to argue with you about which to say. But we also have happy. Happy. They're often the same idea, the idea of fortune. And we use this word to describe happy because we think happiness comes through fortune or through privilege. If the circumstances are just right, I will be happy. These things just happen. And that is not the way happiness comes. Happiness comes through making right choices. And look at the choices that Ruth made that led to it. Do you think that Ruth was a happy person? There were moments of tragedy. Certainly there was sadness at the loss of her husband. It was no happy prospect to go into a land and to be with a widow with no means of support. And yet because of the character that was hers, and she kept her responsibilities and did what she should do, yes, I think you see a serenity there. And I think in the end you can certainly say that Ruth was a happy person. And it wasn't just happen so. These were not things that just happened to occur. They came about because she made the right choices. And mark this down. You young people want happiness, and you old people want happiness. And folks like me want happiness. And there's one way to have it, and that's to make the right choices. You don't just sit and expect privilege to occur and people to take care of you so that happiness is going to come. Happiness is going to come because of what you do. Ruth chose God over idolatry. That was one choice that she made that led to her happiness. And Ruth chose to serve someone else other than herself. And that's something that man does not understand today. The basis of most of our psychology is find out what is good for you. Get in touch with your feelings. You hear sports stars and they're going to sign a multi-million-dollar contract and people says, oh, I'm sure they will do what's right for themselves. That's not going to bring happiness. It may bring wealth and it may buy some things. But there's a paradox of life, and we need to learn it. Happiness does not come from grasping and getting all I can for myself. Happiness comes from serving others. And do you know why? Because you are acting in harmony with God. You are acting in harmony with how God made you when you do that. God served us in sending Jesus here. Jesus served us. He illustrated it even in the washing of the feet of his disciples. That is the nature of God. And if I rebel against that and I seek first myself, I am not going to find happiness. Happiness will come to me when I quit thinking about my happiness. When young people are married, I tell them, don't think about what you are going to get out of this marriage. Think about what you are going to put into it, what you are going to give. And if you expect simply to get, it is not going to work and you'll not find happiness. But if you give to it everything you possibly can, if you will think of your mate above yourself, then you will find happiness or stand the greatest chance of it. And that is simply a secret of life. In Matthew the 10th chapter, in verse 39, those who seek their lives are going to lose it. Those willing to lose their lives are going to gain it. Remember that. If you want to be happy, number one, you've got to make the right choices. And one of the choices to make is not to think first of yourself, grasping everything you can for yourself, not expecting everybody else to supply your happiness. The first thing you do is, after seeking God, is serve others. And then happiness is going to come. And happiness is not going to come without that. There's another choice that Ruth made, and it was to be controlled by honor rather than the frivolous. She could have sought the young men. She could have sought the rich young men. And evidently, from the gist of the story, had no difficulty in finding and having anyone she wanted to. But she chose still to act out of honor, to stay with Naomi rather than to seek a husband, because she felt responsibility for this person. I'm a part of this family now. I could leave like Orpah, and I could find a husband, and my problems are over. But there is someone I have to serve. And she sought out Boaz rather than the young men, whether rich or poor. The formula for happy people: happiness doesn't just happen. Happiness comes through making right choices. And you'll find what choices to make in God's Word and in His wisdom. And then there is this consciousness of God which brings blessedness. There is blessedness of God consciousness. Look at the 2nd chapter in verse 4. Boaz goes out to meet his workers. And in this day of Gideon and Samson and Delilah and gang rape by the Benjamites, we find this. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said unto the reapers, Jehovah be with you. And they answered him, Jehovah bless thee. You know, I've done some thinking about that. I did this years and years ago. I hate to speak regarding brethren in general. People speak too general when they say the Church of Christ does this or that. The Church of Christ believes this or that. Everybody in the Church of Christ is like this or that. Sometimes we do that when we're critical of ourselves. And I don't believe you can do that. First of all, it shows we may not understand what the Church of Christ is. But there are none of us who have broad enough experiences to do that. But in general, when I grew up, I rarely ever heard anyone say, God bless you. Or praise the Pentecostals said that. But you know, they're just emotional people anyhow. Well, largely, I think that does contribute to why they are what they are. I think that a lot of right-brain people, is that the part of the brain that, don't want to get involved in that. But most brethren didn't. And I've wondered why. And I think many of us, what happened was, we had so many scriptural battles to fight, and we fought them, and we came out not politically correct, but religiously correct. And that's where the emphasis was. And we became involved in making sure all of that was right, and that cannot be gainsaid. That must be done. But we didn't keep a balance that we ought to. When I say we, I'm saying in general, I'm not saying everybody. But in this day of wickedness, in the time of the judges, this man going out to greet his workers says, God be with you. And they answered him, Jehovah bless thee. There was a God consciousness in what they did in their lives, when there was not, evidently, in the lives of a lot of people around them. And remember what he said to Ruth, blessed be Jehovah, under whose wing you have come for protection. You are going to be spared. You're going to be taken care of. You have done that which is right toward a servant of God, and God is going to take care of you. And there is blessedness. And that, one of the reasons that this story ends up as it does, is because there was the God consciousness that was there that caused people to act in honor. He acted in honor, redeeming the land. He got witnesses there. He didn't just go take it. He knew there was somebody who had the right before him, and he went through the process, and he gave the honorable opportunity. He did what Romans 12:17 requires of us, provide for that which is honorable in the sight of all men. And his good was enhanced by his effort in doing this. How much more satisfying it must have been, rather than taking Ruth and running off and marrying her, to say, someone else has the right first. And he saw to that, and he acted in honor, and he went through the steps he needed to take. Now, before Marlene broke her leg, there was something I was going to tell you about this trip to Bear Mountain. And it just emphasized something to me, and it has something to do with people gleaning in fields, and has something to do with Boaz going to the gate of the city and getting the elders of the city out there to witness all of this and following all the protocol. When you do something in order to accomplish something or to come to an end, there's reward in the effort that is put forth. And the results are far more satisfying. We took the grandchildren, and then Daryl was over from Illinois, and Jeff was down from, Jeff and Libby were down from Rhode Island, and went to climb Bear Mountain. And we looked at it, and we thought, well, maybe we'll go halfway up it. But we got halfway up it, and there was a waterfall further up, so we decided to go up to the waterfall. And then when we got to the waterfall, we thought, well, there's the top up there, so we'll go up to there. So we climbed up to there. Well, that wasn't the top. But after we'd gone that far, we might as well go the rest of the way. So we went all the way to the top and got up there and found there's a road there. We could have driven up it. And we saw the other people who drove up it, and they drove up in the cars and looked out at its tremendous view, got back in their cars and drove off. But we reveled in that thing. In fact, we found the highest little rock there was on top of that mountain and stood on it, so we made sure we were on the very top of it. Even the kids did all of that. We stood and we watched the view, and we played around there, and we thoroughly enjoyed. And I think we were enjoying it more than people who drove up. And I was noticing that, and I thought, are we just crazy? I said, well, you know, what happened here is we worked for this. And it was a struggle, and there was a feeling of triumph in doing this, and we accomplished something, and there is joy in doing that. If there is a goal out there, don't sit and wait for it to fall in your lap. Do something to accomplish it. The goal will be all the sweeter because of the effort that was put into it. And how much sweeter it must have been to Boaz, knowing he had satisfied God's law, he had taken each step he needed to take, and God had blessed him and God had provided for him. And that'll provide a good basis and a wonderful philosophy for life. Now you know how to be happy. And if you are not happy, you know what you need to start doing, and that is making the right choices. That doesn't mean every moment is going to be filled with wondrous pleasure. Naomi lost her husband. She lost her sons. Orpah and Ruth lost their husbands. Ruth had to get out in the field and glean. Happiness is not something that happens in this particular moment. Happiness, Mortimer Adler. I don't know if I'm quoting your husband again now or not. Sister Adler, I quoted her husband one time when I meant to be quoting Mortimer Adler. I think I'm quoting the right person here. I wasn't quoting him. I would just call Mortimer Adler by her husband's name, and I can't remember what that is unless it's Mortimer. And I don't. Do you wonder what in the world I'm talking about?